our agenda. So welcome to the Integrative Research Review Panel. Today we have esteemed scholars who come from diverse methodological perspectives, and I then introduce the chair of this session, Sarah McCarthy.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm Sarah McCarthy from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, chairing this session, and it has been an honor to chair this session. So I want to tell you a little bit about the inspiration for the panel, which was from Nell Duke and Marla Millet's book entitled Literacy Research Methodologies, including the third edition, which is coming out in 2020. I was also motivated by the series of books focused on literacy methods published by Teachers College Press in association with the National Conference on Research back then in Language and Literacy, and in particular by David Bloom and his colleagues' chapter that analyzed a literacy event from multiple perspectives. By sampling multiple methodologies for studying the lives of children and youth to inform classroom practices, the panel addresses this year's theme, one in which we, quote, celebrate the polyphony of our rich and diverse field by recognizing that no one lens can fully capture the complexities and nuances of the phenomenon we refer to as literacy, end quote. Of course, there are more methodologies than can possibly be presented on one panel. Yet these researchers are stars in our field who have dedicated their professional lives to exploring children's and youth's lives and studying classroom instruction to make schools more equitable learning spaces. The topic was inspired by Shirley Bryce Heath's groundbreaking study, Ways with Words, Language, Life, and Work in Communities and Classrooms, published in 1983. And the work of so many researchers since then who have sought to understand how we can understand children and youth's language use and literate experiences in their homes and communities to inform classroom practices. Thus, the question that I pose to this panel is, how can we study children and youth's experiences out of school to inform classroom practices? So our first speaker today will be David Bloom. David Bloom is the EHE Distinguished Professor of Teaching and Learning at The Ohio State University College of Education and Human Ecology. He's the director of the Center for Video Ethnography and Discourse Analysis and co-director of the Columbus Area Writing Project. Bloom was president of the National Council of Teachers of English and president of the National Conference on Research in English. He's received a number of prestigious awards from the National Conference on Language and Literacy, American Educational Research Association, and he was inducted into the Reading Hall of Fame in 2008. He served as co-editor of Reading Research Quarterly and was the founding editor of Linguistics in Education. So Bloom's research and teaching focus on how people use spoken and written language for learning in classroom and non-classroom settings, and how people use language to create and maintain social relationships, to construct knowledge, and to create communities, social institutions, and shared histories and futures. His current scholarship focuses on a number of areas, including the social construction of intertextuality as part of the reading, writing, and learning processes, discourse analysis as a means for understanding the development of understanding those practices inside and outside of classrooms, narrative development among children as a foundation for learning and literacy development. Also, he looks at students as researchers and ethnographers of their own communities. Literacy is a set of relationships connecting people to each other in urban environments, and the teaching and learning of argumentative writing. He will bring a micro-ethnographic discourse analysis perspective to the issue today. David, come join us.
Great. Thank you so much.
There's our panel.
First of all, can you hear me with the mic? Okay. Secondly, how do we get the PowerPoint moving here? There we go. Thank you. All right. So first, my thanks to Sarah and to Donna and to LRA for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thinking with you. There's a handout going around. I think you may probably want it as we get to the latter part of this. Are you keeping time for me or somebody? Okay, great. Albert Einstein is reported to have been asked, if you had 1 hour to save the world, how would you spend it? To which Einstein is reported to have said, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes solving it. This talk is going to be like that metaphorically. I am going to focus on deconstructing and reconstructing the question, how can we study children's use experiences out of school to inform classroom practices? Given time limitations, my conversation will necessarily be brief and because of that somewhat distorted. And of course, I am only referencing here the U.S. schooling context. The argument that I'm going to make is that the question, how can we study children's use experiences out of school to inform classroom practices, obfuscates a deeper conflict over personhood in schooling and classroom practice. And that's the argument I hope I'm going to be able to at least outline for you in the time I have left. Let me share my conclusions first, so if I run out of time, you at least know where I was trying to get to. First, we need to frame the languaging of the relationship of out-of-school contexts and experiences to classroom practices in terms of personhood. Personhood is always an ideological model, and diverse philosophies have diversely defined personhood. Third, part of the ideological model concerns how personhood is located historically and geographically, that it is not as an autonomous model. And fourth, personhood is socially constructed rather than given, and it is socially constructed through languaging, as are the underlying philosophies defining personhood as well. By personhood, we mean a shared cultural and linguistic meaning for how person as a category is defined, including what kinds of persons exist, what attributes a person had, and how those attributes are distributed. As an aside, let me say there is a political movement now that has developed that is using the term personhood. My use of personhood has absolutely nothing to do with what they are saying or doing, and I find them a rather repulsive group. So, in my conversation here, let me begin by working from the ground up, that is from actual events, and trying to base on actual events some theorizing. In the handout, you can see some of the references we use to inform our work as part of our review of the extant research out there. We're going to look at a brief transcript from a 12th grade English language arts classroom from a languaging perspective. This classroom was in a public school, an urban community, and a working class neighborhood, and was predominantly African American, as was the teacher. It was a college track classroom within the school, and the teacher focused the year on argumentation and social justice. The particular lesson they were doing is when the students were presenting their arguments around different topics, and the one we're going to look at is a group of students, 4 male students, who were given the topic and are making the argument with regard to bullying is a normal condition of adolescence. Schools should recognize this statement as true. Well, as you look at the transcript there, I'm only going to highlight parts of it because of time. But what you will see is the students begin to make an argument. And I should tell you that these students were rather reluctant. And they talked sort of half to the audience and half to themselves like this as well. And so we often can't hear them, but we hear the teacher revoicing what they say, and therefore we can have a sense of what they said through the teacher's revoicing. So student one begins, I think the reason why this is bullies, should be accepted is like, and we can't hear it. And then the teacher revoices. So the bully won't be as ostracized as pushed out. You say we expect it from this age group, and the student says something, and again the revoicing, so if we punish, that's interesting. Do you guys understand? And she's talking to the rest of the class. And the way she says that's interesting suggests that the students are onto something new and surprising for her. And this is what I want to take a look at, what they're onto, and what she validates through her responses. How might we approach what is being languaged here? And that's a key issue on what I want to talk about. And let me suggest 3 of many possible philosophical frames that we might use to think about how it is. And I'm going to be making some points by going through these frames. The first is from American Transcendentalism. This is a philosophy that I believe still influences much of how we think about education, about lives, and so forth. I'm also going to take a look at it from a critical theory or critical theories point of view, and also from what might be called an endarkened epistemological philosophical framing based on the work of Cynthia Dillard and a number of others. All of these philosophies, I argue, exist within us just below the level of consciousness. All of these help frame how we understand and divine issues such as personhood and how we act on them. They are often in conflict, and they offer complex relationships among each other. So one of the key issues that we often talk about is authenticity. Things outside of school are authentic, things in school are non-authentic. And the derivation of this notion of authenticity can be traced through a number of scholars back to the work of both pragmatist philosophers and to American transcendentalists. American transcendentalists such as Emerson, Thoreau, and Rousseau, who's obviously European and not American, but was very influential here. And the whole binary that they created between nature and natural person, actually they used man, right? Between nature and society and how those influence it. With society and its institutions being a corrupting influence on natural, in their terms, man. Nonetheless, they were not against schooling because schooling needed to provide the discipline and knowledge that would allow the natural in the child to come out and to develop so that they had empathy and morals and have imagination. And so we see this language from American transcendentalism pop up a lot in the research that is engaged in looking at the relationships between classroom practices and what happens outside of the classroom. Yet we need to remember that American transcendentalism had a sibling relationship with scientific racism at the time, such as the work of Louis Agassiz that attempted to use science to prove racial hierarchies. It was also associated with the notions of primitivism and all of the sort of issues that are associated there, as well as the concept of the noble savage. Indeed, in order for American transcendentalism to establish itself, one had to create a notion of personhood that was distributed in ways that were hierarchical, right? So although they were able to have sympathy for enslaved Africans, and Emerson spoke a lot in abolitionist terms, that was not to suggest any kind of notion of equity, but rather it was to have sympathy towards the, quote, noble savages that were enslaved, right? So this relationship and the understanding of race and racism underlying some of these philosophies that frame how we think about personhood at this sort of just below level of consciousness needs to be understood as part of the historical motif that exists over time in thinking about these relationships as well. Right? Let's take a look then very quickly again in terms of various kinds of critical theories as they help us understand the relationship between what happens in school and what happens out of school. And here I particularly have in mind those critical theories that are derivative of Marxism, neo-Marxism, post-structuralism, and post-colonialism, and so forth. Here, there's a look at power relationships and the oppressive conditions and privileging that goes on that are derivative of hierarchical relationships among economic classes, such as Marxist structure and superstructure, and the structuration of a broad range of social institutions as well. Key to this understanding is the notion of false consciousness, alienation, value as exchange value rather than use value, and human capital development as the development of surplus value that can be commodified and monetized. Now the issue here is that critical theories, while helping us understand these oppressive conditions and relationships, in a sense also single-dimensionalize people. That is, people are single-dimensionalized into these notions of these power relationships and hierarchies, which is not to say they don't exist, but the single-dimensionalization is also an aspect of how personhood is being defined. We see one response to that in Emma Goldman's work, and you may remember her famous phrase, "If I can't dance, I don't want to come to your revolution." So the notions of joy and dance and caring and empathy are argued by some to need to be on the same level as an understanding of addressing oppressive relationships in how we conceptualize the notion of personhood. And that brings us, if you will, to endarkened epistemologies from the work of Cynthia Dillard, but is also, at least in my reading, we find it also in the work of Bettina Love, Peter Paris, Stephanie Power Carter, and a number of other theorists as well. And in these, we have a centrality of the notion of spirituality. And the notion of spirituality is involved in a person's relationship with themselves, with others, and with the world in which they live. At the center of such spirituality is emotion, caring, and moral being. A manifestation of spirituality as expressed by these philosophers is in the inherent relationship of an individual to community constituted in large part by a moral commitment to. So what I've done now is lay out three philosophical frames for thinking about personhood. There are others, and had time allowed, I would have tried to include others, such as empiricism and pragmatism as well. Well, let's go take a quick look at Stephanie Power Carter's and how she frames the notion of sawubona, which is a concept born out of Ubuntu philosophy. And this is the notion of people seeing each other, and that we can only see each other if we are seeing each other mutually. That there is no notion of the idea of I, like I see. It is only of the notion that I see as part of we see together. And this is another interesting part of thinking about how we might define personhood from an endarkened epistemological framework. Well, let's go back to this transcript for a second that we began with and take a look and ask the question about how is personhood being socially constructed here. One of the things that we can see is that they're constructing bullying as part of a notion of an attribute of personhood that is embedded in experiences that people have when they are littler or younger. And that is, rather than define it as a notion of good and evil, of good and bad, it is a notion of trying to understand people more holistically and variously as in connected with others and connected within the places and within the histories to which they are bound and to the geographies in which they are bound. Notice that in that transcript, if we ask, what is the construction of personhood going here, is that the notion of self-esteem and caring relationships among each other is highlighted and foregrounded in what they are saying. And notice as the teacher revoices what they were saying, the notion that would be important to connect schooling practices to emotional, moral, and social states, and not just these notions of structuration of punishment over behavior. The notion that marginalization is inherently connected to bad feelings, part of the emotional states that are effective to the notion of personhood and part of that. So the notion here that these male students have in making their argument is that we cannot dismiss the personhood of people who are engaged in bullying, and we cannot see them as the other. They must be seen as part of the we. And therefore, we cannot marginalize them. And what I'm trying to get at now is not what you think about bullying or what I think about bullying. What I'm trying to get at here is the socially constructed notion of personhood that is going on in this classroom, that is being socially constructed by the students and the teacher together as a way, as a frame of seeing the relationships. Well, then let me go back to my final summary comments again, which I shared with you earlier. We have argued for the need to frame the languaging regarding the relationship of out-of-school context and experiences to classroom practices in terms of personhood. We have argued that personhood is always an ideological model and diverse philosophies have diversely defined personhood. Part of the ideological model concerns how personhood is located historically and geographically and in terms of how people relate to each other as part of defining themselves, others as well. We have argued that personhood is socially constructed through languaging, as are the underlying philosophies defining personhood. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So the reminder of the importance of theoretical underpinnings in any kinds of research endeavors that we undertake. And so now I'd like to turn to a presentation by Nell Duke. Nell Duke is Professor of Literacy, Language, and Culture and serves in the combined program in Education and Psychology at the University of Michigan. Nell has served as co-principal investigator of projects funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, and the George Lucas Educational Foundation. She was awarded the P. David Pearson Scholarly Influence Award from our very own organization, LRA, as well as receiving awards from AERA, NCTE, IRA, and the Michigan Reading Association. Duke serves as a consultant for a number of educational policy organizations and speaks widely on literacy education. Her work focuses on early literacy development, particularly among children living in poverty. Her specific areas of expertise include development of informational reading and writing in young children, comprehension development and instruction in early schooling, and issues of equity in literacy education. She has published numerous books and articles for a range of audiences. She will bring her expertise in experimental and quasi-experimental designs to understand how they can inform classroom instruction. Specifically, she'll walk us through the design of a study to compare the effects of a kindergarten curriculum which intentionally incorporates children's experiences from outside of school to a more traditional kindergarten classroom curriculum.
Good morning. Thank you for being here, and I appreciate Sarah including experimental research on this panel. So I feel like I've been, if you're at LRA and you've been tasked with talking about experimental research, you're sort of being cast as the villainist potentially. So I thought I'd just put that right out on the table there, me as Maleficent. But I am going to argue, as you might expect, that experimental and quasi-experimental designs actually do have something to contribute to our understanding of the question. So just because I know there'll be graduate students here in the room, and just as a refresher for everyone, I'm going to spend a few slides talking about what experimental and quasi-experimental designs are, and then I'll move into addressing the question posed. So experiments are a type of methodology, and like any methodology, they have both affordances and also constraints. What experiments do very well is they help us figure out cause or impact. Okay, so they do that well. They also can contribute to understanding the why a cause or impact has happened. In those cases where we do experiments at a sort of micro level and we manipulate small aspects of a question one at a time in order to understand what might be the underlying factor or factors causing whatever phenomenon we see. Experiments are not well suited to do a whole bunch of other things. They don't describe well. They're not good at investigating the past. They don't help us understand the process of design the way that design experiments do, and lots of other things. So they're certainly not the be-all and end-all. Many of you know I absolutely reject the language of the gold standard, but they are one methodology that has contributions to make. The logic of experiments rests highly on the notion of random assignment, that when you randomly assign people or crops or whatever you're studying, when you randomly assign them to groups and you have a large enough sample for that randomization to do its job, and then you manipulate just one thing between the two groups. You make one thing different, like a curriculum or something else. Then when you see a resulting difference, you can attribute the resulting difference to the thing that you manipulated. That's the logic of experiments. Quasi-experiments are a little bit different. They have a lot of the same underlying logic as experiments, but without randomization. They don't have randomization as part of their work. So when we do quasi-experiments, we have to be a lot more cautious in drawing causal conclusions because it's harder to eliminate all the other possible explanations for the phenomenon. Statisticians are busy and have been quite busy in the last decade finding ways statistically to try to make quasi-experiments more trustworthy, trying to find ways that we can be more confident about conclusions we draw from quasi-experimental designs. So you may have heard about any of the things I have listed on the screen. I thought I would take a second just to explain regression discontinuity designs because these are being used quite heavily in policy research, and it would be useful for you all to know, if you don't, sort of how regression discontinuity designs work. So how these designs work is they try to take advantage of sort of natural experiments, if you will, that occur in the world. So an example from work I'm doing, if you're interested in the effects of Young Fives programs, these programs for kids who are either not quite 5 but close, or just turned 5 but are deemed not ready for kindergarten, whatever. If you are interested in that population of children, you are going to have a hard time running an experiment. You could, but it's tough to randomly assign kids to go to a Young Fives program or not. So a way to look at this is to use a regression discontinuity design. What you do is you take the birthday cutoff, so let's say in this case it's December 1st, and you construct a sample that has children who are just past that cutoff and just before that cutoff. You make the assumption that there's not anything systematically different about a kid who was born a week before December 1st and a kid who was born a week after December 1st, that that's essentially random variance, okay? And then you can compare those two groups of kids, and if you see a difference there, you can attribute that difference to what that cut point, December 1st, caused, in this case, the enrollment in Young Fives programs. So that's an example of how regression discontinuity designs work. Again, not as good as real experiments in terms of giving us confidence in a causal conclusion, but a tool at our disposal when needed. So there are a lot of myths out there about experimental research, and I would like to address some of them. So first of all, we still have lots of folks, you may encounter this, those of you who work a lot with schools and districts, I encounter this all the time, the idea that you can only do experiments in labs. So we have to explain that it did used to be the case that we mainly did psychological and educational experimental research in labs, but that now there are lots and lots of field-based studies that are experimental. Another assumption is that experimental research must be short-term. That is also not the case. In fact, we have experiments in which people have been followed for decades after the experimental condition occurred. And we have year-long, sometimes 2-year-long experiments that exist in our field of literacy. Another thing you hear from people is, well, experimental research can't control for everything. It's actually not true. The logic of randomization, if you do it across a large enough sample, is that you can control for everything except what you introduced as the difference between groups. And we all benefit from all kinds of medical interventions that are in fact live because of the logic of that randomization. Another thing I hear a lot, and I hear it here at our beloved conference, is that experimental research is inherently unethical, hence my now as Maleficent image early on. In fact, like any methodology, there are many ethical considerations that one has got to consider when engaging in experimental research, and there are many things we have to protect against, but it is absolutely true that you can conduct experimental research in an ethical manner, and I'd be more than happy to share with anyone different ways that I've tried to do that over time in my own work. And a final myth that I'll be addressing head-on in the remainder of my remarks is that experimental research can only address a narrow set of topics. I think it's fair to say that in literacy research it often does only address a narrow set of topics. So for example, phonemic awareness gets a lot of experimental research, but it's actually not true that it can only address a narrow set of topics. So the panel question was, how do we study children or youth's experiences out of school to inform classroom practices? And the first thing that I had to admit to my esteemed colleagues here is that you can't actually answer this question with experimental research. The reason is because we can't do an experiment out of school and then generalize results in school. That's against the rules of experimentation. So that is not a go. But what we can do is we could study in school the impact of an intervention that deliberately incorporates out-of-school literacy practices. So that's the way that I'm going to take the question. So a little bit of background for the hypothetical study I'll walk you through. Experimental research is very rarely used to study in-school instruction that is intentionally designed to be influenced by out-of-school factors. So the folks that study out-of-school literacy practices and the folks who do experiments are not in the same space most of the time, let alone doing studies, though there are exceptions. As an example of 45 studies on culturally relevant pedagogy, and I realize that's not exactly the same thing, but there's some overlap here, so I'll take it as a case, of a wonderful review, if you haven't read it, of 45 studies of culturally relevant pedagogy. The authors identified only one of those studies as having an experimental research design. I have had the pleasure with colleagues to conduct an experimental study of the impact of place-based, project-based curriculum. So I will take this as an example that is, again, not the same as the topic posed to us, but in the ballpark. So I want to tell you a little bit about it. In this study in second grade classrooms in high poverty, low performing school districts, we used a matched pair design over a large number of classrooms to test the impact of place-based, project-based units. This is an example of one of our units in the discipline of geography. The second graders' purpose was they wanted to persuade, or the unit set up to have them persuading people that their community, their local community, has compelling natural and human characteristics. So to achieve that purpose, they created persuasive brochures about their community that focus on the natural and human characteristics of the community. Children got to choose which aspects of their community to feature in their brochure. So children often chose cultural institutions or natural spaces like parks that they visit often, and they used those as the subject of their brochures. In another unit in civics and government, children visited a local park or other public space, and it was often a park or public space that children had much experience with outside of school with their families and others. And then their task was to identify, in part by interviewing and surveying others, and in part from their own experience, improvements that could be made to that local park or other public space, and then to prepare a persuasive presentation and individual persuasive letters to the local city government to try to convince them that they should make these improvements to the park or other public space. So in a cluster randomized control trial, we tested the impact of these 2 units and 2 other units, and we found that children who experienced these units compared to social studies instruction that was based on a textbook in most cases or state developed units had statistically significantly higher growth in both social studies and informational reading. So that's to illustrate, hopefully, this notion that we actually can use experimental methods to address questions that are much closer to the question posed by Dr. McCarthy than typically is the case. So if I were to go on to create a hypothetical study as charged, I might study a kindergarten curriculum that is designed to draw on children's outside of school experiences in a very intentional way. Some of the features of this curriculum, and I'm drawing here from my and my collaborators' current work doing curriculum development for children from birth to age 8 in a project called the Great First 8 Curriculum Development Project. More information will be available about that soon at greatfirst8.org. And this will be a free curriculum, so I'm not pushing anything for money. Anyway, so in this kindergarten curriculum, there would be things like, there might be a unit, is a unit somewhat like this, but this is hypothetical, might be a unit in which teachers begin by drawing on information from home visits that they conduct in order to inform the way that lessons and units written in the curriculum play out with children. Children might interview family members and members of the community. Children might bring in texts that they find in their neighborhoods and their homes and use those texts as part of the work of the unit. Children might have socio-dramatic play settings. Yes, play in kindergarten, a radical idea, but one I refuse to give up. They would play in socio-dramatic play settings that were designed to mimic settings from their homes and communities. And they would write, as one of their culminating activities, biographical sketches of people in their community that they have learned about through their families and through their interactions with others in their community. So with a curriculum like that, I would then conduct, again, the hypothetical, a research study in which the question is, what is the impact of whatever this kindergarten curriculum is on kindergartners' academic and social emotional growth? I would use an experimental design because I'm asking a research question having to do with impact. And when I'm asking about impact or cause, experimental design is a really good choice. I would randomly assign schools to either implement the curriculum, that would make them the treatment group, or to receive an equivalent amount of professional development in whatever curriculum they're currently using, or I could select a more traditional curriculum. And the reason I'm having the equivalent amount of professional development is because otherwise you don't know whether it's the curriculum or the professional development that would be causing the change you see, so that's why we would hold that constant. I just explained that. The reason we do this at a school level is because one of the real challenges that we face in doing experimental research in school settings is something called diffusion of innovation, which basically means that when something cool is happening in one classroom, it tends to be the case that other classrooms start to pick up pieces of that. So this would probably be an example of a study you'd want to do at a school level, that you'd want to randomize at a school level. In terms of the comparison group, we would want to make sure that they were absolutely equivalent in every way, which means we'd need a really large sample size and all sorts of true baseline measures. And something I would do that experimentalists typically don't do is to assign sorry, lost my train of thought. To assign people in the groups a year before, so teachers get a year to practice the curriculum. I did not see I'm just going to go quickly through these slides, sorry. Oops. So what we would be able to do from the study that I've just described is we would be able to fill in the light blue blank there. This kindergarten curriculum, which intentionally incorporates children's experiences from outside of school, has a, and then we would be able to say positive, neutral, or negative effect on kindergarten children's academic and social emotional learning as compared to a more traditional curriculum. Now, in fact, it would be a little bit more sophisticated than that because we'd be talking about effects on various measures, and we might find that there were effects on one measure and not another. But this is basically the conclusion that we would be able to draw at the end of the hypothetical study that I have presented to you today. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much about theory matching questions and questions matching methodologies through this process as well. So our next speaker is Amy Stornaiolo, who's an associate professor of literacy education at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on methods for studying adolescents' digital literacy practices, especially new forms of networked writing and cross-cultural collaboration online. She's received a number of awards for her scholarship and is currently serving as co-editor of the flagship journal of the National Council of Teachers of English called Research in the Teaching of English. Stornaiolo will explore how literacy researchers might study the multimodal writing and the way it's on the move in a digitally connected age, traversing national borders, cultures, languages, spaces, genres, disciplines, and lives. She'll examine writing's mobile capacities from the perspective of transliteracies, an approach to understanding the increasingly networked ways writing is created, shared, hybridized, and circulated across timescales and complex configurations of persons, platforms, and contexts. She examines not just how writing connects, but displaces, specifically why some texts, people, and ideas flow across spaces while others do not, and how these flows and movements are influenced by systems of colonial logics, racialized policies, gender-enabled orientations, and other historic inequities. By drawing on longitudinal research in partnership with adolescents and young adults across school, home, and network spaces, she'll offer some specific methodological suggestions for studying multimodal composing across contexts and provide implications for designing more equitable and humanizing learning spaces for young people. Amy?
Thank you to Sarah McCarthy for that lovely introduction and for inviting me into this august company. I'm really honored to be here today. And I just realized, is this the clicker?
Arrow.
This
Green arrow, right there.
Okay, great, thank you. I just want to make sure I'm doing it right. And so I've been a little overambitious in what I might be able to cover. So I've created slides online, so if you want to play along at home, you can do that. I'm also going to play some videos, which we won't probably have time to look at in their entirety, so you can look at that later if you'd like. Okay, so you've heard about our guiding question, how can we study youth's experiences out of school to inform classroom practices? And I would say that a lot of my work centers right on that question. But I've been thinking particularly about that in terms of the digital tools and contexts that permeate all of the spaces that we all occupy. And so this idea that schools and out of schools are these separate contexts in which things and practices and ideas and people don't move across, or is that they're already bounded, is one that I'm interested in studying further. And that led me in some ways to David Bloom into unpacking the question. And I spent a bunch of time in some of the writing up of this panel presentation thinking about whether we should and how should we study those experiences. And it's really not a new set of questions. So this idea about whether and how to study young people's everyday life experiences has been taken up by a number of scholars, including our Donna Alverman on the stage here, and Chris Gutierrez, and Glinda Hull, and David Kirkland, and so many others. And I point us to what Glinda Hull had said a long time ago in 2003, where she said we really have to take care not to domesticate or romanticize youth culture, even as we celebrate it clear-eyed. So what does it mean to kind of walk that tightrope? And I would submit that that question, even though it's been studied for quite a long time now, has new urgency. And it has new urgency because we're living in precarious and divided times. And also that there are potentials that young people are taking up that are really exciting to think about how they assert their identities across different spaces and counter mainstream discourses that serve to silence or oppress or marginalize them. I really love Yolanda Seeley-Reese and Marcel Haddox's ideas around how youth of color are using these digital tools as tools of emancipation and empowerment, and particularly in light of the fact that schools often criminalize and police Black and Latino students in disproportionate fashion. And there's been a lot of research around that, about the way schools, in the ways that they incorporate technology and digital tools, do that. They don't just perpetuate inequality, but actually exacerbate it. So this is really an urgent set of questions, and I'm interested in thinking about those questions through the lens of multimodal composing, and specifically thinking about the ways people write and remix and share and distribute their writing in, and how can we study that in ethically attuned and critically turned ways. So I think about this as a set of ethical questions, right? So our methodologies and designs always have these ethical valences in the decisions that we make. But there are particular issues when we're thinking about studying online practices, and a bunch of colleagues and I have been studying that as well. There's a number of literacy researchers who've been taking this up in terms of trying out critical and participatory approaches, and I've listed a few here who've been really influential in my work and thinking. But the way that I wanted to talk to you about things today was through the lens of transliteracies. So Anna Smith and Nate Phillips and I have been thinking about this question of transliteracies as a way to explore the fluid, dynamic, contingent, and intersectional dimensions of practice that frame difference and disjuncture as a norm. And so we've been defining transliteracies, kind of thinking about the relationship of multiliteracies, and what are some ways to think about things on the move as critical and creative social practices within networks and systems. And so one of the things that frames our thinking is what Rebecca Lorimer-Lemmert has called the paradox of mobility. So even as things start to move more radically, there is a subsequent and simultaneous restriction of movement. So we can think about who gets to cross borders, who's held up at the border, what are the ways that certain texts circulate, and how are those related to kind of larger histories and discourses of power. So one of the things that we've done is tried to find and develop and think about tools for studying this kind of multimodal composing on the move. And here's just an overview of 5 of them. We're starting to talk about these not necessarily as tools anymore, and thinking about these as moves that researchers can make, and as moves that people make as they're engaged in literacy practices in mobile ways. And so we've, in an earlier paper, talked about emergence, uptake, scale, and resonance. We're starting to think about emergence in terms of attunement, and starting to think about some of the work I've been doing with my colleague Ebony Elizabeth Thomas on restoring as a transliteracies tool. So I'm going to go through these one by one and show you a little bit of video about how I've been doing this. I wanted to situate this within a long-term partnership project that I've been doing with a high school in Philadelphia. It's considered an innovation school, and we've been working, they have a bunch of maker spaces, so we've been working with their existing maker spaces and also to create new maker spaces. We have a literacy maker space, for example, that a lot of this work you'll see is engaged in. I've been working with a broad team, and I am really grateful to have a number of supportive graduate students who I'll mention throughout here as well, helping on that project. So I wanted to think for a minute about the tool of attunement. And we're thinking about this as like a way of tuning into and out of the indeterminacies of meaning making, and how might you attend to effectively charged moments in process. So I want to introduce you to a young woman that I've been working in partnership with. She goes by the name of Wolfie, and this is an example from her sketchbook where she keeps some of her writing. She's an avid Wattpad writer, and I'm going to let her introduce you to Wattpad in a second. But it's an online community for writers. I met with and work with Wolfie in the school setting, but she has this rich life offline, and so as part of our work, we've been exploring together what are some ways that she thinks about herself as an author in these spaces, and how does that influence and not her work in the literacy lab and in school more generally, and in other areas of her life. So this is her introduction to herself. This is an image of her at one of the events that we've had, and I've been thinking about this in terms of Paul Pryor's integrative analysis. How do we read across the data in order to kind of make sense of the whole? And one of the ways we've been doing that is through some of the work with some screen capture. So I'm going to show you two kinds of screen capture. So what is she tuning into here in terms of what she publishes online, and how can I as a researcher tune into some of that? So can we just play a little bit of this video?
I honestly felt like we weren't going to get it done, but now it actually looks like, why? Because before it just looked completely blank, and it's like there's too much blank space to fill in. But now it's just like we can do it. But like, and then seeing it fast.
Okay, so actually that's not the right video. Sorry. If we can pause that. Sorry. So it should be the introduction video that looks like this. I have a bunch of videos. Those of you who are following along at home can probably see it. So this is Wolfie introducing herself. Okay. So as they're getting that organized, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how we've been using screen capture. So one of the things that's really interesting if you work with young people that you might see a lot is a lot of these YouTube videos where they narrate their account of what they're doing. And so this is what she's doing here.
Wolfie on Wattpad is my full username. I'm 17 years old. I've been working on a partnership with Miss Amy. I think that's pretty much it. I enjoy writing. That's another thing, which is why I have 25 stories on here and one draft. I just realized that. And if you do look at myself, I have a small little intro about...
Okay, we can pause it there. That's fine. And so she's excited for you to go on and read her stories. And one of the parts of this work about being in partnership is I asked her to introduce herself to all of you. She knows that I'm here. She knows that you all may be looking at her work, and she's quite excited about that. And so this idea of using the camera, both the screen capture and also the facing the camera and kind of narrating into it as part of that work about what are we tuning into, both what she's clicking on as well and what she chooses to highlight about herself. As soon as this comes back on, I'm going to move to the next tool to talk about uptake. So tuning in, right, is one way of seeing how people are kind of taking up things, but what are the ways, and I draw a lot on David Bloom's work here in thinking about uptake with Anna and Nate about how can we take into account in visible ways what other people take up. So these are some stories by Wolfie. We can see that her first one, which is a creepypasta example, which is an internet horror genre, has 6,600 views, and she's got a huge readership. But some of the stories are taken up in ways that others aren't. One about herself, that she talks about the life of being in love, only has 217 viewers. And I asked her about whether that disparity, what she thinks about that. And she says, well, I actually polled my readership to ask, should I continue doing this? What do you all think? Comment yes or no. And then she talks about the ways that those reactions have shaped how she goes on to write more and what she writes about, right? So thinking about the ways she sees the work as it's being taken up, guiding her practice, and that helps me in thinking about studying uptake. And that's another video from her showing you about the uptake of her work. Resonance is some of the work that we've been doing around things that you can't trace in quite so easily in easy pathways. So what are the ways that things resonate with one another? And in networks, we think a lot about collective meaning making. And so this is an example of where we drew a resonance map. My co-author Matthew Hall and I literally mapped out an online network that we were working with. Wolfie was one of the writers on that educational network. To see where these themes came up, and there was this really interesting theme around perseverance that came up, and it often was echoed in these posts like this, where a young woman contextualized this with the Roses Growing from Concrete lyrics by Tupac Shakur, and posted this image as a response, and that then cascaded across this global network. And so we see a young person in Korea also posting a similar kind of nature persevering as metaphors for thinking about their own lives. So we've seen issues around resonance come up. We've also been thinking about scale and what are the ways vertical and horizontal scaling relationships help us see issues of power. And so one of the ways we've been experimenting is through this time-lapse video, which was showed earlier. And my doctoral student, Bethany Monet, has been doing some really pioneering work with video in looking at time scales. So this is a mural video in which you can see we've sped up the time, and we showed this to the students as an elicitation tool to understand how they can understand change over time, how we as researchers can see change over time, and you can see the mural unfolding, and you saw a little bit of it play earlier, so I'm going to let that stand there. Restoring is one of the most exciting tools that I've been thinking about with Ebony Thomas around how do young people reshape narratives to reflect their lived experiences and perspectives, especially when those narratives do not include them. Some of the work that we've been doing, and I've been doing specifically in the media maker space, is around data restoring. So how are young people collecting data about themselves and creating data art to story themselves, and then they literally wear it on their bodies. So this is some example of data art t-shirts that we've been studying, and I've been experimenting with data art and visualization tools as well to help me understand the data. So thinking about these are all the different designs that they've created, and what are the ways that those designs can be studied visually, but also through tools like Voyant, doing all sorts of language study as well about what they're saying about their designs. So I'm going to conclude with just 4 points, implications for practice, and then I'll leave you with those. So the first is like asking whose interests are served in maintaining these in and out of school boundaries, I think is an interesting question. I think another one is like, what are the ways we can make power visible in our research and pedagogies? And I think some of those tools like scale and restoring are one way that we're trying to do that as we work in partnership with young people. Langsher and Noble talked about the ethos stuff of not just like worrying about technologies and what people are doing with these spaces, but also remaking systems. And then finally, how can we design for emergence in research? So what are the ways that things can surprise us and emerge? So I'm going to stop there. Online, we have some of our some publications that we've drawn on for that. Thank you very much.
So many different tools that are available. Our next speaker is Immaculada Garcia Sanchez, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Temple University. She's a linguistic anthropologist with a strong interdisciplinary training in anthropology, linguistics, and education. She examines children's and youth's communicative practices in the context of educational institutions, both secular and religious, peer groups and families, and across linguistic, cultural, and national boundaries. Her book entitled Language in Muslim childhoods, the politics of belonging, is rooted in 2 years of ethnographic field study in southwestern Spain and Morocco. The project examines how Moroccan immigrant children in Spain navigate the local national policies of inclusion and exclusion in the wake of increased levels of surveillance directed toward Muslim and North African immigrants. She examines the linguistic repertoires displayed by these children in informal and formal learning contexts to identify commonalities in discursive practices across formal and informal contexts. In a comparative research endeavor, she's bringing together the stories of personal experiences of Moroccan immigrant children in Spain and Latino immigrant children in the U.S., highlighting these children and youth's own perspectives and understandings of their lived experiences in relation to larger ideologies and discourses. Her edited book, just published in 2019 with Marjorie Oriana, is entitled Language and Cultural Practices in Communities and Schools, Bridging Learning for Students from Non-Dominant Groups. I'm pleased that she'll offer a critical dialogue between linguistic anthropology, educational ethnography, and social-cultural development of bi- and multilingual immigrant children and youth to respond to our question today.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for being here today, and I also would like to start by expressing my gratitude to the organizers of this panel for inviting me to reflect along with them on how we can study children's experiences outside of a school to inform classroom practices. And as Sarah just mentioned, I joined this conversation by drawing on my empirical research at the intersection of linguistic anthropology, in particular language socialization, and the anthropology of childhood to discuss how ethnographic inquiry and discourse analysis makes visible the agentive and innovative character of children's interactions in both formal and informal learning situations, as well as how in these situations children engage in a wide array of semiotic means to make sense of these social activities. And my goal is to explore the relationship between language socialization researchers and literacy scholars and our shared concern with equitable learning context. In my own research, I have examined immigrant children's linguistic repertoires and practices in familiar, neighborhood, and various institutional schooling and religious contexts. But in the last 5 years, I have increasingly focused on what we can gain and learn by looking at immigrant children's linguistic practices outside of the classroom, particularly in light of the fact that one of the most persistent and recurrent socio-educational discourses in the last half century, really, is that which links the lack of educational and socioeconomic success of youth from non-dominant communities either to their supposed sociolinguistic deficits or to ideologically exaggerated discontinuities between their linguistic practices across contexts, usually between home and school practices. And indeed, we are witnessing the virulent return of many of these deficit perspectives about the linguistic literacy and cognitive assets of young people from economically disadvantaged and minoritized communities, most recently in discussions of the supposed word gap, which is related to this idea of mismatches. So in this politically charged atmosphere, when deficit discourses have come back in full force, often authoritatively dressed in scientific modes of representation, I want to reclaim what linguistic anthropologists have shown since the 1970s, which is the richness and the complexity of everyday youth language and literacy. But before I go any further, for those of you who may be less familiar with this research paradigm, what are some of the methodological features that allow linguistic anthropologists and language socialization researchers to advance important theoretical and practical concerns in literacy research? And there are three important methodological tenets that provide a holistic perspective to understanding how different social settings structure immigrant children's language use and modes of participation. So longitudinal ethnographic approaches, including long-term participant observation, interviews, and analysis of material artifacts, are central to capturing the children's trajectories of language use within and beyond speech events and across multiple timescales. Multi-context approaches to understanding community practices afford a critical comparative lens to observe children's agency, sophistication, and creativity in relation to language and literacy demands across sites of activity. And this analytic lens includes attention to locally situated and racialized intra-community contexts that children navigate sometimes in the course of a single day, from school to the park, to training, to go to the mosque, to go to the doctor. And of course, the third methodological tenet, detailed discourse analysis of audiovisual recordings of interactions, has included the ways in which a myriad of signs, from different languages to gestures to institutional labels to material arrangements of learning environments, come together in everyday communicative encounters both within and across events. And this has allowed me to illustrate the agentive and innovative character of immigrants' children's language use in both formal and informal situations. And of course, I understand these interactions, and you have a snippet, an example of a transcript that I produce in my analysis, as always contingent on and constitutive of expectations about national origin and ethnicity, race, gender, class, ability, immigration status, etc. So this richly layered combination has allowed linguistic anthropologists to contribute important insights into the ideological basis of what counts as literacy in schools, including how literacy events themselves become institutionalized. And a number of discontinuities, like I mentioned at the beginning, between home and school language practices that have been shown to be consequential in how children participate in activities and are exposed to literacy practices both across communities and within community settings. But in reclaiming how linguistic anthropology allows us to see the richness and complexity of everyday youth language and literacies, I want to transcend its discontinuities framework by showing how this richness both maps onto and sometimes even exceeds what schools are asking immigrant children to do. And I want to underscore how important it is for researchers to also identify clearly similarities and generative points of continuity between home, community, school that can be productively centered and expanded upon in schools. This perspective, which I unpack and develop in a recent edited volume with my colleague Marjorie Orellana, builds on the cultural modeling paradigm established by Carol Lee, and we argue for schools to be places that recognize and sustain everyday community knowledge and skills, leverage those skills towards the cultivation of other competencies, but also work towards leveling the value we place on everyday communicative practices in schools. One of the book's main takeaways is a reevaluation of the discontinuities research framework, which, while initially was an important force in counteracting deficit ideologies, it nevertheless, as we now know, had some problematic unintended consequences by refining the differences between home and school linguistic input in non-dominant communities. So in my work, I have identified generative and bidirectional points of continuity rather than focusing on discontinuities or mismatches that show that, in my case, Moroccan immigrant children in Spain are using everyday, and in their everyday life, community, family engagement, many of the academic literacy practices that are considered prestigious in schools. So grounding all of this now in a specific example, how can linguistic anthropology methods and analysis help teachers and schools reimagine language and literacy education for immigrant children in ways that center these children multilingual and bilingual strengths, that also help overcome these dichotomous framings that I've been talking about, that very often have informed educational approaches to academic language development. We have home, school, academic, versus colloquial, scientific versus everyday, so all these dichotomies. For this purpose, what I have done in one of my recent projects, I analyzed the linguistic repertoires of Moroccan immigrant children in Spain, how they use them in and out of school settings to identify commonalities across formal and informal learning contexts. And building on the longitudinal multi-context discursive analytic methodological paradigm I described earlier, I used this comparative frame to sketch the basic contours of what these children are being asked to do in school with what they are already doing in two fairly common everyday practices: neighborhood peer play and language brokering for adults. Basically, and in all of these settings, I pay particular attention to certain categories of analysis. In particular, I pay particular attention to type of linguistic and communicative practice, literacy strategies or modes of reasoning, forms of participation, including how relationships among participants are shaped by the structure of the activity setting, both context and sociocultural expectations, and also the ultimate goals of the activities. So my findings suggest that there is a high degree of overlap between the communicative practices and literacy strategies displayed in these interactions and what children are expected to do in many school tasks. So let me give you, of course, in this very short period of time, I'm not able to show you that in detail, but let me give you just like a few snippets of that. So for example, in language brokering interactions in pediatrics encounters, one of the things I have found is that children very often do not render the messages literally. Rather, like in this small example I have here for you, in Fatima, this young girl, strategically modify the pragmatics of the doctor's recommendation by mitigating the illocutionary force of the statement in the translation she's rendering to the parent. And this strategic decision making in translation not only shows a great deal of pragmatic competence, but also fine attunement to audience awareness in crafting messages differently depending on who the intended recipient is. On the playground, as players explain moves, teach each other how to play, or give playing advice to their friends, they display sophisticated deployment of bilingual linguistic tools, exhibit rhetorically deft use of argumentative language functions, and key modes of reasoning to make the abstract concrete. So analysis such as these allow me to do three things: to challenge enduring deficit discourses about immigrant children as linguistically lacking, to interrogate academic literacy in school as situated, contested, and ideological by showing how the literacy practice that immigrant students deploy when language brokering or in neighborhood play both maps onto and sometimes even exceeds what schools are asking them to do in literacy tasks. And it also transcends problematic aspects of this homeschool discontinuity paradigm by identifying generative and bidirectional points of continuity. But, and I think many of the other speakers have been talking to this theme too, there are also significant differences that put in sharp relief the tensions of trying to use our knowledge of children's experiences outside of the classroom to inform classroom practice. And in fact, one of the most important jobs of scholars like us who want to connect scholarship and practice in this way is to illuminate the tensions inherent in trying to make immigrant children bilingual practices outside of school a central feature in literacy programs that pursue pluralistic democratic outcomes. Such as, how do we point to concrete orientations and pathways for schools and classroom that center on these rich community practices, while at the same time being critically aware that what is currently valued in schools is not objective and neutral, but very much symbolically, structurally, and materially predicated in relations of power. This is a very difficult question, but very important because as models in culturally responsive teaching, culturally sustaining pedagogy have proliferated in our field, there's still little guidance for educators on how to actually honor this linguistic knowledge and experiences of immigrant children in school. So to conclude my contribution to this panel, And in keeping with this year's themes, which I love, which emphasizes literacy research, diverse ways of illuminating the future, I want to highlight the central role that linguistic ethnography can play in envisioning pluralistic developmental pathways to success. And I just want to sketch a couple of concrete pathways in which immigrant children's everyday practices and ways of learning can be centered, sustained, and expanded in classroom that are based on knowledge produced by linguistic ethnographic methodological approach. So a good place to start would be to create spaces in the classroom for children to use their language and literacy experiences outside of school. Invite immigrant children and youth to share their experience with literacies and languaging so that teachers can acknowledge and validate the richness of their students' communicative practices outside of school. These conversations could include the similarities and differences the children themselves have noticed between the multiple languages they speak, the local situated ideologies that the children themselves are developing about the value and the use of languages in their repertoire. And these conversations could help teachers build on children's bilingual knowledge to enhance their awareness of the cultural, structural, and formal properties of languages without reinforcing stigmatizing binaries and ideologies. And explicitly cultivate a student's meta-linguistic awareness and meta-pragmatic knowledge that would help immigrant children see the complexities of what they are doing outside of the classroom while enable them to draw from their entire linguistic repertoires. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that discussion. And now I'll turn the time over to our discussant, Donna Alverman. As you know, is a University of Georgia appointed Distinguished Research Professor of Language and Literacy Education. She also holds an endowed professorship, the Omer Clyde and Elizabeth Parr Aderhold Professor in Education. Her research focuses on young people's digital literacies and use of popular media. Author of numerous articles, she has several widely cited books. Currently, she helped in designing an interactive website to learn how a community of researchers and research objects can push boundaries associated with creating and disseminating original work. Finally, I was so thrilled that Donna agreed to be discussant for this panel, since I've had multiple opportunities to hear her insights and perspectives about a range of topics and methodologies. Thank you, Donna.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for choosing to come to this session, and I want to again thank Sarah McCarthy for organizing it and for having the knowledge that this is an important session, as you'll see in my first content slide. I don't know if she knows that connection or not, but it opened up a whole new world and new relationships with people as a result of you organizing this particular session. So thank you. I also want to thank the panelists who each provided me in advance their papers or their slides, and that was helpful because as a discussant, I really do need to have time to think about what I'm going to say about each of those papers. And, I changed my mind and I changed my slides, etc., because things are coming in all the time off the internet, like new studies, etc. And so it was a pleasure to have some time to read and think about what you were saying, and to be able to, I hope, represent what you think is important, because the way I'm organizing my remarks will be, I picked what I thought stayed with me as sort of like the main idea of what they were saying, and then after that was the fun part too, because I could begin to think, what do I know in the field of research here, in our field, what do I know across this wide spectrum of paradigms, philosophies, theoretical frameworks, methodologies? What can I pick out that would be something that would not enlarge upon necessarily, but sort of capture what they were saying, but in a perhaps a little bit different perspective? So each of my comments will be around that structure. First, what they said, taken verbatim, and then what that made me think of, and then I went digging, because quite often I really couldn't remember what I knew about some of their work. I know all of their work in the past, but some, like a speculative study or a hypothetical study, I had to be thinking then what Nell was doing, for example, now, and what she plans to do. So, and this is the slide I was referring to, okay. And it was interesting because I knew this session was important, but I didn't know exactly how important. I didn't have the numbers, the big numbers. I just knew it was important. And so I had the privilege of actually citing this study before, but then I went back to it and I started to read it. And I will tell you that it is well worth your time. Unfortunately, I can't include the excellent tables where they organize and list all the journals they searched and how many articles they found, and then whether or not it was a design, methodological, theoretical conclusion they were drawing. And they did use the appropriate, in my mind, the appropriate quantitative statistical chi-square analyses that give us a feeling of, credence, and so much so, in fact, that I cannot wait for their next study, which is an update of this study that I'm sharing with you today. It is in the line of being reviewed for research in a journal, and I was pleased to learn, too, a bit overwhelmed, that they're adding 4 other journals. Can you imagine the work of going through? So, and also there are some other new things they're doing in their update, and that'll be out, I hope, shortly. I hope it makes it through. You can see their research questions, and like everybody on the panel, they match fairly well with the questions you came up with. But I really thought the panelists did a beautiful job of saying, you asked us to answer this question, that's what we'll do. And therefore, this tied in nicely. The findings, did you see how little I put that? And I don't have it in boldface. That's sort of intentional. It is intentional. Because it's disappointing to think that, these are refereed journal articles that got accepted. And we don't, and there are many other things that they found, by the way, I'm just pulling this one out. We're not, as a field, telling how we're framing our studies. And if we don't do that, how can we have our questions aligned with, make sense with, or how can we even know how to go about the methodologies that Nell was talking again about in terms of how qualitative, quantitative, or whatever differ. So I know I'm probably in that list of 1,200 and whatever studies, because sometimes, you just do a study because you want to know what works, okay? And I'm not the What Works Clearinghouse, I'm not supporting what they're doing necessarily, but truly, you're in the middle of teaching a course, an online course like I do, and something happens, and truly, I don't think theoretically first, I think, wow, is that exciting? I want to explore that, or study that, or whatever. And as people tell me, everything you think is interesting, Donna, is not worth a study, okay? They're not convincing me yet. Okay, so I also to remember rather that this particular session is based upon the idea, Sarah did a great job of focusing in on something. It would have been impossible if we were just given freedom to talk about what we wanted to. And so this in-school, out-of-school time research, I can't think of a better article, really, than the 2002 RTE article. And it's what I call a classic in the field. Many of the findings that Catherine Schultz was able to identify now almost 20 years, 18, 20 years later, are actually rather still pertinent today. And I've always wanted to get her sort of over a coffee, haven't done that, always busy, to say, so what do you think about that 2002 study? I like it. And if you haven't read it before, or even to refresh your minds, you might do that, because that's important to know about what we're doing here today, the 4 panelists' papers. In this paper, I was interested because of first of all, I love the way David and his colleagues actually analyze the data so closely. So Ms. Howard's classroom, he couldn't obviously show all of that today, but if you read the paper when it comes out in the yearbook, is that right? This will be available next year. And I like it because he's stuck with personhood for a long time, and I do believe in that. And I tried to think about somebody outside the field who knows what he knows, he and his colleagues know. This is a favorite study of mine, or sorry, rather, it is not a study. There's a person named John Carroll at the time who was a columnist in the Oakland, California area. And what Marty Rapp-Rudell did in her presidential talk in the very late 90s, she actually used this story. It was a nice day. I was just strolling down a sidewalk. I left the part out where he said that Oakland, California is often maligned for not having nice sidewalks. No. He said, because I did not speak to this girl, about a 10-year-old, I don't know exactly what the parameters of her experiment were, but it was something like, how far can I walk backwards and not run into something, or tripping, or otherwise embarrassing myself? This is what kids do, he says in his column. They perform experiments. In an ideal society, these experimental urges would be gently harnessed into the primary schools, or I'll go even higher, into the schools where the kids are going. And I'm not bashing schools. I'm just quoting or enlarging upon what he said. He said, however, it's not happening right now. Worse luck. But we still have small girls walking backward. And Marty concluded her talk in a way, her presidential address, in a way that I think very closely ties to what David and Sarah were doing in their paper. I'll let you read that in red. In a nutshell, it says to me, we still have a long ways to go, and this was in the late 90s when she delivered the paper. Not to be a downer on this, but it means those of you sitting here today and your colleagues back home, et cetera, have a lot of work to do in order to stop this. And it's a widening gap. That's even more frightening that we don't know. Nell's study, a hypothetical study, this is the paragraph that I chose from her work. I love the positive, negative, neutral, the way she shorthanded that. And her paper reminded me of the Imerdina, Young, and Damasio study, where, again, I'm no neurobiological expert, but it does seem it makes sense to me that it would be impossible to build memories, engage in all of these activities without some emotional attachment to it. And she, in her paper, talks about affect, okay, as well as effect, because it is experimental. In Amy Sorniolo's paper, of course, that's kind of right in my area. And so I was interested to see, and I loved the article that has come out, people in my classes, because I am interested in what Amy's interested in directly in my own research. They love that JLR article that you and Anna and Phillips not just published, but it's getting a lot of attention by people in the field. And I don't know if you probably do know this because you know the authors, Magnifico, Lammers, and Kerwood, but this is one of those papers that came out just as I was thinking about what was I going to say about Amy's paper. And so it is available, but it is also early online, which means it could be changed later on. But what I liked about it is they are actually developing the methods for what Amy and her two co-authors were arguing were needed. And Immacolado's paper was ideal because it was a matter of pointing out some of the things that I know when I'm teaching the teachers of pre-service teacher educators. We're a graduate department only, and so therefore we teach the graduate students who are earning their doctorate degree how to teach pre-service teachers. Not an unusual model. But I did take account again of the fact that Amanda Sawyer has and she has a long list of colleagues who wrote that paper with her, and that just came out, and it talks about curating, teachers who curate, and that is in Enma's paper. And she's excited about it. So am I, and we'll see whether or not and how fast the paper copy of that comes out. And I drew from that to the fact that this overall, and I think this applies to all of us, we still like traditional and dispositions of learning. There's no doubt about it. They're good. We can't throw that out. But I also get worried when people are talking about new literacy studies that they make it sound like it's new. And the people who use those terms still are the people who say it's not new in the temporal sense. In other words, you don't just say that the one on the right has now taken over the one on the left. It is a binary, which I think troubles me somewhat. New means it's just changing technology is changing, immigration patterns are changing, etc. And so everything it's always been happening. And so some people say it was badly named new. I kind of like it because it is always new in the sense of changes going on around us. It does not put a value, in my mind, and also in Colin Lancashire and Michelle Noble's mind, who worry that it gets thought of as like, it's taken over now, the traditional. That is not what we mean by that. It is a contrast, yes, but it is not taking over. I know because I'm in a lot of the schools in Athens, Georgia, and I probably see more, well, I know, not probably, see more traditional than I do see new literacies. But, we don't have to have an either or, and that's my last slide. I think we need to rethink learning boundaries. That's not a new thought. We've been thinking that all along. That's why Sarah put this group together, so that we as a good organization, good research organization that we can be relevant, but we can also look back and say, where are we not maybe doing some of the important research that needs to be done? So that's my idea at the very beginning. That's a bias. I saved that till the very end. Of course, everything I've said is filtered through my head, so it's all biased to some extent. But I have a question. We don't necessarily have to answer that in the discussion room here, but I'd like to leave you with the question. Should a call go out for troubling the in-school, out-of-school binary? Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm stating my bias, but then saying, I don't know, because I've had conversations with people who do wonder whether that binary should stay or go or whatever. And of course, you've heard 4 papers today that either in some way supported or perhaps didn't support going out and troubling it, which means to sort of like disrupt some of the assumptions underlying it. Thank you.